Margaret Whitmore believed she owned everything she could see, but she had no idea she was standing on land that belonged to someone she had already dismissed, and that mistake was about to cost her more than reputation. It would cost her her pride. The late afternoon sun stretched across 12,000 acres of rolling Texas ranchland, painting the grass in gold as luxury SUVs lined the gravel drive and guests in tailored suits and silk dresses gathered around Margaret, her short silver hair perfectly styled, her posture sharp, her voice smooth with practiced authority as she raised a crystal glass and gestured outward. "Every acre you see here represents legacy," she said, her heels clicking softly against the stone patio. "This ranch is one of the finest privately held properties in the state." The group murmured in admiration, some nodding, others already imagining ownership, investment, power. And then the moment shifted, subtle at first, a quiet creak from the far gate. A figure stepping in where she did not belong, boots dusted in dry earth, jeans worn from long days, a simple cotton shirt catching the wind. Emily Carter walked in without hesitation, her long hair tied loosely, her eyes steady, not defiant, not timid, just calm in a way that didn't match the room. A few guests turned, confused, then amused. Margaret paused mid-sentence, her smile tightening just enough to notice. "Excuse me," Emily said, her voice soft but clear, pointing toward the grazing fields beyond the fence. "That section hasn't been rotated in weeks. It's going to strain the soil." A ripple of laughter spread instantly, low at first, then louder as Margaret tilted her head slightly, studying her like an inconvenience. "I'm sorry," she replied, her tone cool and cutting. "And you are?" Emily didn't answer right away, and that silence, that brief refusal to explain herself, made the air shift in a way no one could quite name. The guests leaned in, curious, entertained, waiting for the shepherd girl to realize her place. But Emily only stood there, boots planted on the same ground Margaret had just claimed, as if she knew something they didn't, and somewhere beneath the polished surface of the moment, something unseen had already begun to crack. Margaret's smile did not disappear, but it changed, sharpening at the edges as she slowly lowered her glass, the soft clink echoing across the patio like a signal. And in that moment, every guest instinctively followed her lead, turning their attention fully toward the unexpected interruption standing in dusty boots on polished stone. "This area is restricted," Margaret said, her voice still smooth but now edged with something colder, something practiced, the kind of tone that had dismissed people for decades without ever raising volume. A few guests exchanged glances, amused curiosity building as they watched what they assumed would be a brief and predictable correction. Emily remained still, her posture relaxed, her hands at her sides, not defensive, not apologetic, simply present, and that quiet presence unsettled more than defiance ever could. "I am just pointing out the land needs attention," Emily replied calmly, her eyes moving briefly toward the pasture again, as if the soil mattered more than the conversation. A man in a navy suit let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "That is rich," he muttered, loud enough for others to hear, and the laughter spread again, warmer this time, more confident, as if permission had been granted. Margaret tilted her head slightly, studying Emily from head to toe. The worn denim, the sun-faded fabric, the absence of anything that signaled status. And in her world, that absence meant everything. "You must be new," she said, her lips curving into something that resembled kindness but carried none. "We have staff for that, and they understand boundaries." Emily did not move, did not step back, and that refusal to retreat drew more eyes, more attention, the atmosphere tightening like a wire being pulled too far. "I know exactly what the land needs," Emily answered quietly, and for a brief second, just a fraction of a second, something flickered across Margaret's expression, not doubt, but irritation, as if the script had shifted without her consent. She set her glass down with deliberate care, the sound controlled, precise. "Security will escort you out," she said, no longer asking, no longer explaining, just deciding. And the word escort carried a weight that made several guests straighten, phones subtly lifting now, sensing a moment worth capturing. The distant hum of an approaching vehicle drifted across the ranch, unnoticed by most, But Emily's gaze shifted slightly toward the sound before returning to Margaret, steady, unshaken, and in that silence between command and consequence. Something invisible pressed into the air, something none of them could yet name, but all of them would soon feel. The two security guards appeared from the far side of the patio, their footsteps measured, their expressions already set with the quiet certainty of people who had handled situations like this before, and as they approached, the energy in the crowd shifted from casual amusement to something sharper, more expectant. Guests leaned slightly closer. Glasses paused midair, conversations fading into a low hum. Margaret stepped back half an inch, just enough to re-establish her control of the space. Her chin lifting, her voice calm again. "Please see that she leaves," she said, not even looking at Emily anymore, as if the decision had already erased her presence. One of the guards gave a polite nod and turned toward Emily. "Ma'am, we are going to need you to come with us." His tone professional, not aggressive, but final. Emily did not move, not a step, not even a shift in weight. Her eyes remained steady, not on the guards, but on Margaret, as if the rest of the scene did not matter, as if the only conversation that existed was the one that had not yet been finished. A few guests began to smile again, reassured by the familiar rhythm of authority being enforced. "This is exactly what I was talking about." A woman in a cream blazer whispered to her companion. "Boundaries," and a quiet ripple of agreement followed. Phones lifted a little higher now, capturing what they believed was the inevitable ending. The removal, the dismissal, the restoration of order. But then Emily spoke. Again, her voice low, almost gentle. "You might want to wait," she said, and something about the way she said it, not pleading, not resisting, but certain, caused one of the guards to hesitate for just a second, just long enough for the distant sound to grow louder. The hum of an engine turning into the unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel. Heads turned instinctively toward the driveway, where a black SUV was pulling in with deliberate speed, not rushed, not hesitant, but purposeful, and behind it, another vehicle followed, then another, a small convoy cutting through the golden light, dust rising behind them like a curtain being drawn back. The laughter faded completely now, replaced by a quiet tension that spread through the group. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly as she watched the vehicles approach, irritation flickering beneath her composed exterior. "This is a private event," she said under her breath, more to herself than anyone else. But Emily did not look at the vehicles, did not turn, did not react. She simply stood there, boots grounded, gaze steady, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. And in that growing silence, as engines slowed and doors began to open, the balance of the entire scene shifted in a way no one there was prepared to understand. The SUV doors opened one by one, not hurried, not chaotic, but with a precision that immediately felt out of place in a setting that had just been filled with laughter. A man in a dark suit stepped out first, followed by another carrying a leather portfolio, their eyes scanning the patio with quiet focus, not curiosity, not confusion, but recognition, and that alone shifted the atmosphere. The security guards exchanged a quick glance, their confidence softening just enough to notice. Margaret straightened slightly, her expression tightening as she stepped forward, reclaiming her position. "This is a private event," she said, her voice firm, controlled, the tone of someone used to being obeyed without question. But the man did not respond to her, not immediately. Instead, his gaze moved past her, across the guests, and landed on Emily, standing exactly where she had been, unmoved, unchanged, as if the entire scene had been waiting for this exact alignment. "Ma'am," the man said, his voice respectful, measured, and in that single word, something invisible broke across the room. A subtle but undeniable fracture in the hierarchy everyone thought they understood. Margaret's brows drew together, a flicker of confusion slipping through before she masked it. "I believe you are mistaken," she interjected quickly, her smile returning but thinner now, strained at the edges. "She is not a guest." The man finally turned his head toward Margaret, and for the first time, there was a pause, not long, but long enough to register, long enough for the silence to deepen. "We are not here for a guest," he replied calmly, then looked back at Emily. "We are here because of her." The words settled heavily, like dust after something unseen had shifted beneath the ground. A murmur rippled through the group, low and uncertain. Phones that had been raised for entertainment now hovered midair, forgotten. Margaret let out a small, controlled laugh, one that did not reach her eyes. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice slightly sharper now. "This property is under my management." The man did not argue, did not raise his voice. He simply opened the portfolio, the soft rustle of paper cutting through the silence as effectively as any shout. "That is exactly what we need to clarify," he said. And then, without looking at Margaret again, he stepped closer to Emily, lowering his voice just enough to show respect, but not secrecy. "Everything is ready when you are, Miss Carter." And in that moment, as the name landed, in the open air, unfamiliar yet weighted, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, because something about the way he said it made one thing painfully clear: the story they thought they were watching had never been what it seemed. The name lingered in the air like a question no one dared to ask out loud. Miss Carter, spoken not with curiosity, but with certainty. And that certainty was what unsettled the room more than anything else. Margaret's fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her glass, her posture still upright, but no longer effortless. "I think you are confusing her with someone else," she said, her voice measured, controlled, but now carrying a thin edge of urgency that had not been there before. The man in the suit did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached into the portfolio and removed a single document, crisp, official, the kind that did not require explanation. He held it just enough for Emily to see, and she gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, but enough, always enough. "There is no confusion," he said calmly, turning slightly so the paper faced outward, not aggressively, not theatrically, just clearly. "Ownership records were finalized this morning." A ripple moved through the guests, quiet at first, then growing, voices lowering, heads leaning closer together, the tone no longer amused but uncertain, recalculating. Margaret stepped forward now, unable to remain still, her heels clicking against the stone with a sharper rhythm. "This property has been under my management for years," she insisted, the word management landing heavier than before, as if she needed it to hold more weight than it actually did. The man inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her without yielding. "That remains true," he said, "but management and ownership are not the same." And that distinction fell into the silence like a line drawn too clearly to ignore. Emily finally shifted, just a single step forward, her boots brushing lightly against the stone, the sound soft but unmistakable. And for the first time, she looked directly at the group, not at Margaret alone, but at everyone, her gaze steady, unhurried. "I let it stay that way," she said quietly, her voice carrying further than expected, not because it was loud, but because no one else was speaking, no one else could. The guests who had laughed earlier now stood still, expressions tightening, phones lowering slowly, as if the moment they had wanted to capture was no longer something they understood. Margaret opened her mouth, then paused, the words not coming as easily as before, because something had shifted beyond her control, beyond explanation, beyond the version of reality she had been presenting just moments ago. And in that growing stillness, the truth did not arrive with noise or force. It settled, undeniable, rewriting the entire room without asking for permission. Margaret's composure held for a moment longer, but it was no longer effortless, no longer natural. It was something she was actively maintaining, and everyone could feel it, the slight delay before she spoke, the careful way she chose each word. "If this is some kind of clerical error," she began, her voice controlled but tighter now, "it will be corrected immediately." But the confidence that once filled her tone was thinning, the certainty slipping through the cracks of a reality she no longer fully controlled. The man with the portfolio did not interrupt, did not argue. He simply turned another page, the quiet sound of paper echoing louder than it should have. "There is no error," he said calmly. "The transfer was executed through Carter Holdings, effective as of 9:30 this morning." A few guests exchanged sharp glances. Names like that carried weight, not always recognized instantly, but never meaningless. Emily remained still, her presence unchanged, as if nothing about this moment surprised her, as if this had always been the outcome, just delayed. Margaret let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but without warmth, Carter Holdings, she repeated, as if saying it might reduce its impact. I have worked with every major stakeholder connected to this land. That name has never appeared. And for a brief second, that sounded like control again, like knowledge reasserting itself. But Emily's gaze did not shift, did not waver. That is because I never needed it to, she said quietly, and the simplicity of the answer landed harder than any explanation could have. The crowd shifted again, no longer leaning forward for entertainment, but stepping back, creating space, as if instinctively recognizing that they were no longer part of the center of this moment. The security guards, once so certain, now stood still, unsure whether they were meant to act or simply witness. The wind moved lightly across the open land, carrying the distant sound of livestock. A reminder of what this place actually was beneath the polished presentation. Margaret looked around, just briefly, just enough to realize that the room she had controlled minutes ago was no longer hers in the same way. Eyes that once followed her now drifted elsewhere, toward Emily, toward the quiet center that had not changed while everything else had. And in that shift, subtle but undeniable, something settled into place, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of finality that does not need to announce itself, because everyone can already feel it. The silence did not break. It deepened, stretching across the patio like a weight no one knew how to carry. And for the first time since the gathering began, Margaret Whitmore did not immediately speak. Her eyes fixed on Emily with a new kind of focus, not dismissive, not amused, but searching, as if trying to reconcile two realities that refused to align. This is not how ownership works, she said finally, her voice lower now, less for the crowd and more for herself, as though repeating it might restore the order she understood. But no one echoed her this time. No one stepped in to support the narrative she had been building all afternoon. The guests who had once laughed now stood quiet, their expressions shifting from confidence to calculation, some subtly adjusting their stance, creating distance, others lowering their gaze altogether, unwilling to meet Emily's eyes. The man with the portfolio remained still, his presence no longer an interruption but a confirmation, and beside him, the second vehicle door closed with a soft, deliberate sound as another figure approached, a legal advisor, composed, precise, carrying authority without needing to display it. We can review the full documentation if you would like, she said calmly, directing the offer toward Margaret. But her tone made it clear that this was not a negotiation. It was a courtesy. Margaret's lips parted slightly, then closed again. The response caught somewhere between pride and the undeniable shift. Unfolding around her, Emily took another small step forward, not to dominate the space, but to occupy it fully, her boots resting firmly against the stone that only moments ago she had been told to leave. You have done well managing it, she said, her voice steady, not condescending, not warm, simply factual, and somehow that made it harder to accept, harder than anger would have been. Margaret's shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly, the acknowledgement landing like a quiet reversal of roles. But this land was never yours to claim. Emily continued, her gaze unwavering, and that sentence, spoken without force, without volume, carried more weight than anything else that had been said, because it did not argue, it defined. The wind moved again, brushing across the open acres behind them, and for the first time, Margaret seemed aware of it, aware of the space not as something she controlled, but something she stood within, something that no longer answered to her presence. And as the truth settled fully into the room, undeniable and complete, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to say that could change it. The air did not return to what it had been. It could not. Something fundamental had shifted, and everyone present could feel it settling into place, reshaping the moment without noise, without force. Margaret stood still, her posture still upright, but no longer commanding, her presence no longer the center that everything revolved around. And in that quiet unraveling, the smallest details began to stand out. The way her hand no longer reached for her glass, the way her gaze no longer moved across the crowd but remained fixed, held in place by a reality she could not redirect. Emily did not raise her voice, did not step closer than necessary. She simply stood there, grounded, her presence calm in a way that made everything else feel louder by comparison. "I did not come here to take anything from you," she said, her tone even, measured, and that alone shifted the perception again. Not a confrontation, not a victory being claimed, but a truth being placed where it had always belonged. The legal advisor stepped slightly forward, her voice precise, respectful. "All existing management contracts will be reviewed under Ms. Carter's direction," she said, addressing the space as much as Margaret, and that sentence carried a quiet finality, not a threat, not a warning, simply a continuation of what had already been decided. The guests began to move, subtly at first, repositioning themselves, aligning not with authority as it had been presented, but with authority as it now existed. A man who had earlier laughed now cleared his throat and adjusted his jacket, avoiding eye contact. Another lowered her phone completely, slipping it into her bag as if the moment had become too real to capture. Margaret's lips parted slightly, as if to respond, but no words came, because anything she could say would only echo against the silence that had already answered her. Emily turned her head just slightly, looking out over the land, the wide open acres stretching beyond the patio, the same land that had been described, displayed, claimed, and in that glance there was no triumph, only recognition, as if she were simply seeing something that had always been hers. And when she looked back, her eyes met Margaret's one final time, steady, unwavering, not unkind, but unyielding, and in that moment, the difference between possession and ownership became undeniable, because one could be performed, but the other did not need to be announced. It simply was, and the room, once filled with certainty, now stood in quiet understanding of a truth it had failed to see until it was too late to ignore. No one applauded, no one spoke, and yet the moment felt louder than anything that had come before, because silence, when it arrives like this, carries its own kind of truth. Margaret Whitmore stood exactly where she had claimed authority only minutes earlier, but the space around her no longer responded the same way. The invisible structure that had once supported her presence had shifted, and now she stood within it rather than above it. Her eyes moved slowly across the patio, taking in the guests who no longer looked to her for direction, the staff who no longer moved at her signal, and finally returning to Emily, who had not changed at all, not in posture, not in tone, not in presence, and that constancy made everything else feel temporary by comparison. "I was never trying to mislead anyone," Margaret said at last, her voice quieter now, stripped of the effortless certainty it once carried. Not defensive, not apologetic, but searching for something to hold on to. Emily regarded her for a moment, not with judgment, not with triumph, but with a calm that left no space for misunderstanding. "You believed what you were saying," she replied, her voice steady, and somehow that made it harder, because it removed the comfort of calling it a mistake. It made it a choice, a pattern, a way of seeing the world that had gone unchallenged for too long. The wind moved again across the open land, brushing past the patio and into the distance, carrying with it the quiet sounds of the ranch itself, the low rustle of grass, the distant call of livestock, the steady rhythm of something that existed long before this moment and would continue long after. The legal advisor closed the portfolio with a soft, final sound, and the man beside her stepped back, their work complete without needing further explanation. The guests began to disperse, slowly at first, then with more certainty, conversations resuming in hushed tones, not about opportunity or investment, but about what they had just witnessed. Margaret remained still for a few seconds longer, then turned slightly, her heels clicking against the stone once more, but now the sound echoed differently. No longer a signal of control, just a sound, just a step. Emily watched her go, not following, not stopping her, simply allowing the moment to settle into what it had become. And as the sun dipped lower over the 12,000 acres stretching beyond them, one thing remained clear in the